Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Hi, this is Bob Bazanko from the Green and Red podcast. Scott Parkin, co-host, will join us in a few minutes. But today I'm super excited to talk to somebody who has been important in the worlds of literature and actually activism with regard to the Middle East for a long time. And that's the journalist and author and broadcaster Charles Glass. Charlie has written about the Middle East for well over 40 years now. You're a fellow at the New Americas International Security Program. A lot of books on the Middle East, including Tribes with Flags, Money for Old Rope, The Tribes Triumphant, The Northern Front, and a book I've used in my class, often Syria Burning, which came out in 2016. And then most recently, a book we'll talk about at the end, which is not about the Middle East, but Soldiers Don't Go Mad, which has got really good reviews. And I could go on and on. Your career began in the 70s at ABC News, bureau chief, and adventure in Lebanon, and so forth. Welcome to Green and Red Podcast, Charles Glass.
Thanks, Bob.
Let's get started with something a little off that path. But recently, you had an article, I believe, in The Nation about a visit with Julian Assange, which sadly, I think, on the left isn't getting anywhere near the attention it should get. And actually, liberals probably want to see the guy in jail for life anyway. So it's, even though it's a free speech issue compared to something like Daniel Berrigan all those years ago, it's not getting, I think, the kind of attention and support. And first of all, how's Assange doing? What did you see when you saw him recently? And then we can talk a little bit about what's happening with him.
He's maintained somewhat his morale and his hope that he'll be free one day, but his health is not good. He's confined to a small cell for 23 hours a day, and his 1 hour out for exercise is still indoors, so he hasn't seen the sun in 5 years. He's very pale, he's weak, he's undernourished. The budget for feeding prisoners at the Belmarsh maximum security prison is £2 per day, which is about $2.25 per day for 3 meals a day. He has no one to talk to. He's allowed books, but not all the books he would like to have. He had a radio, but it's broken at the moment, and they're not fixing it. He has no other communication with the outside world except for weekly visits from either his wife and 2 sons or his lawyers, or very occasionally someone like me, an old friend who wants to come and see him. We're allowed to see him for an hour and a bit in a room with other prisoners being visited by their friends and family under very strict surveillance. It's a very severe regime, particularly for someone who has not been convicted of any crime.
You've noted, you mentioned he was getting harassed, and the people who visited him, like you, had a laptop stolen, right? So what kind of pressures are they putting on people outside of in his circle?
Many of us have been under surveillance. I'm part of a lawsuit with another journalist and 2 lawyers whose telephones were taken by the Ecuadorian embassy security staff, and all of our information from our phones turned over to the CIA. This is all public knowledge.
Yeah.
And there's a lawsuit going on in New York now, suing Mike Pompeo and others for violating our right to privacy, and also, in the lawyer's case, violating the privileged communication between a client and his lawyers, which is completely illegal.
Yeah.
But they seem to be getting away with it. Stefania Marizzi, who's written widely on Julian Assange and who was one of the media partners of WikiLeaks, she had her computer stolen. She's been harassed by people unknown. She's been threatened. She's had a very tough time, and she's not the only one.
I think when in the U.S. especially, so much of the Assange story revolved around the allegations in Sweden, but there's so much more to it. Do you want to just briefly, because I think a lot of people still don't really know that much about this, let me just talk a little bit about why is he in Belmarsh right now? What has he done?
He hasn't done anything, as far as
Right.
I'm concerned. He hasn't committed any crime at all.
Of course.
He's there because the United States is demanding his extradition to stand trial on counts under the Espionage Act, which means that he released information that the government did not want made public. For example, the famous video of an Apache helicopter shooting down civilians in the streets of Baghdad, including 2 Reuters journalists, which the Pentagon said was firing on terrorists. But their own video proved, and this was released by WikiLeaks, thanks to Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange, so the public could see clearly that the Pentagon had lied. Then Manning provided many more documents, US State Department documents, CIA documents, and so forth, showing that the United States knowingly was committing war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. WikiLeaks had a previous history where they exposed corruption in Kenya, the evil doings of the Indonesian regime. It's not as if it had just gone after the United States. Assange and his colleagues set up WikiLeaks originally for whistleblowers to have a safe place, a safe deposit box to send documents of wrongdoing in their institutions, which could be private or public institutions. And that it was so secure no one could know who the whistleblower was, including WikiLeaks itself. Then WikiLeaks had to vet the documents and find out if they were legitimate and then would release them. In the case of the State Department and US documents, WikiLeaks cooperated with the New York Times, with The Guardian in London, with El País in Spain, and with Le Monde in Paris, and redacted names of people whose lives might have been endangered if their names had been made public as part of the release. Then the documents were released. When the Obama administration was considering whether or not to prosecute Assange, Obama himself, and remember he was once a constitutional lawyer, decided that if he prosecuted Assange, he would have to prosecute the New York Times and the Washington Post as well, because they were party to this release of documents. They published them, and if you're going to be consistent, you'd have to prosecute them as well. When Trump became president, he decided that was out the window, and he just went after Assange himself. And when Biden came in, he could have gone along with the man who he had served for 8 years as vice president, Barack Obama, and not prosecuted Assange and withdrawn the extradition request from the UK. And he didn't. He decided to proceed with prosecution and is still vigorously pushing for Assange's return to the United States, where he would spend 175 years in prison if convicted. Now, the court where he's going to be tried in Virginia, which is known as the Espionage Court or the National Security Court, of all the people who have ever been put on trial there, not one has ever been acquitted.
Yeah. This is Scott Parkin, who's joined us now, who's the co-host. I don't know if you want to, we're talking about his article on Assange and just the Assange case. What's the current status? I know last year there was a decision in London, which kind of seemed at first favorable, but really wasn't. So what's the actual status of where he is right now in terms of
the decision by Magistrate Vanessa Barrister was that the U.S. case was right on all points of law and that he could be extradited. However, his health was such that if he were extradited to the United States, he was very likely to be a suicide risk. And there had been a precedent the year before of a young man, a hacker, who was autistic, and he had hacked things in the United States. And the British court decided that actually his health would be so injured by the rigors of the American prison system that they wouldn't stick. So on that basis, she delayed the extradition because she also left it open for the British government and the American government to appeal her decision and try to get him sent to the States, despite these health issues. His case comes up for final appeal next month, in February, in the High Court in Britain, and that's his last appeal in Britain. After that, he can appeal to the European Court of Human Rights, which may or may not decide in his favor. But even if it does decide in his favor, the British government has a tendency to ignore the European Court of Human Rights, particularly this government, because it doesn't like it at all.
Yeah, we're seeing that right now in Gaza, where you can just ignore decisions in international law that you don't like. Scott, did you want to add anything to?
Hi, nice to meet you. I was curious about the dangerous precedent being set by targeting of Julian Assange and other journalists for prosecution, or as we see in Gaza for assassination and et cetera.
There was talk at the CIA by Pompeo and others of assassinating Assange when he was still a refugee in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. There was also talk of kidnapping him. Various members of the Obama and Trump administration suggested that he should be taken out to coin the phrase that Hillary Clinton used, but it was never acted on. Congress got wind of it and basically embarrassed the government to withdrawing these discussions and ending these discussions. Gaza is a very different situation. Journalists are being killed in Gaza by the Israeli occupiers because they're there. That's all, just because they're there. Over 22,000 Palestinians have been killed, several hundred of whom are journalists. And it doesn't, I don't know, except in some cases they have targeted journalists, but for the most part, they're just killing all the civilians, including journalists, including doctors, including women and children, including anyone who happens to live there.
Before we segue to that, just with regard to Assange, what's the kind of network of solidarity and support for him? I know I've read articles by you and other journalists, especially supporting him, but does he have any kind of extra kind of governmental support, NGO support, anything like that? What's the outlook going forward?
The United Nations Rapporteur on Human Rights and Against Torture, Niels Melzer, who originally didn't have much sympathy for Assange, but finally went to see him at Belmarsh and then studied the case very closely and wrote a book about it, has called what's being done to Julian torture in every sense of the word. Yeah. And it's illegal and it should not be done to him, that he should be released. And he has been leading the charge at the UN in support of Julian Assange. The Italian journalist Stefania Marizzi, the late Australian journalist John Pilger, and a few others have been very active in Julian's defense. The Committee to Protect Journalists has not been very good about it. Amnesty's been good about it. The Reporters Without Borders have been excellent in supporting his case. The Guardian, which published many of his documents and won awards on the basis of his documents, has been very wishy-washy about it. They finally, along with the New York Times and others, said that he should not be extradited because of the threat it would mean to all journalists. But they've not campaigned on his behalf. They've simply finally come out on the right side, but they've not made it an important issue. And there aren't many articles or network television reports about the Julian's case as it proceeds through the courts.
Scott, or
WikiLeaks hasn't been publishing like they were since the Assange case happened. And I'm curious about how this prosecution is going to stifle whistleblowers and more edgy investigative journalism and the like.
It already has. We should, when the Ukraine war began, we should have been reading documents from Russia. We should have been reading US State Department documents about what the US was doing in terms of aiding Ukraine. And we should have been reading about torture in Russia. We should have been reading about war crimes. Whistleblowers from Russia, Ukraine, elsewhere should have been sending things to WikiLeaks, but they weren't because they can't. Julian kept WikiLeaks going during all those years, the 7 years he was in the Ecuadorian embassy, because he had internet access and people were still using the WikiLeaks safe box. And he released many of the most important documents while he was still in the Ecuadorian embassy. But since he was taken out, when Ecuador withdrew its protection and the British took him to Belmarsh prison, WikiLeaks is basically shut down. And so a lot of things that we should know now about what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in Sudan, what's going on in Ukraine, we don't know because a lot of whistleblowers don't trust the newspapers. Many of the newspapers have a record of when push comes to shove, they turn over the whistleblower to the authority. A woman called Sarah Tisdale was turned over by the Guardian to the British and she went to prison. So you don't want to trust a newspaper that will not, at the end, support
reality winner here with
maintain your confidentiality.
Anything else I was thinking we could segue a little bit to the Middle East because that's an area you've known for so long, for decades. And we've done shows on it. There's a ton of media on it. They tend to go over the same stuff. So I want to see if we could do something take a different approach, given how long you've been there, how well the region. I guess the first thought I have is, are you surprised by the kind of intensity, the ferocity of what Israel's doing in Gaza over the last 3 months?
I'm appalled.
Yeah,
but not necessarily surprised. It is a repeat of 1948.
Right.
Read the history of how the country was ethnically cleansed in 48. It's repeating itself now. In 1949, what Israel called its War of Independence was finally over, they had expelled 3/4 of the Palestinian population to neighboring countries, and then proceeded to demolish 385 Palestinian villages so that those people could never come back. Now, when they've gone into northern Gaza, they followed up their operations with bulldozers, knocking down every building in sight because they don't want them to come back. And the cabinet ministers are speaking openly that they should all go to Sinai and live in tents in Sinai, and that other countries should then take them in for humanitarian reasons. It's not new for the policy of the Israeli state and its predecessors before statehood to want to get rid of the indigenous population so that it could bring in a settler population. It's not a surprise. Even Zionist historians like Benny Morris have written openly that this was the sine qua non of the existence of the state. But they're going to have what Netanyahu now talks about is total security control, everything west of the Jordan River, which is what Netanyahu's recent speech talked about. It means getting rid of the population.
What do you think, and this is just speculative, but what do you think the Palestinian motive for kind of beginning the latest rounds? And obviously didn't begin the hostilities at all. But from October 7th on, do you think that the idea there was to kind of spur on a larger resistance, or it was just kind of
I'm not in touch with Hamas. I can't really read their minds. I don't know. I do know that an attack of some kind was inevitable because of the frustration of living under siege for all these years with barely enough to eat, restricted electricity and water supplies, no ability for people to travel in or out. I mean, it's a horrible life. You can't treat people like that forever and expect them to take it. I was surprised that they were so effective in breaking out and breaking through the Israeli security system, which is very expensive, and uses technology that they export around the world, saying we are the finest crowd control people on earth, and buy our stuff. I don't think anybody's going to buy their stuff anymore because it didn't work.
What do you think about it seems like an expansion of the war, the Yemen, Iran, Hezbollah? Do you see that happening where this is expanded to something even bigger?
It's unpredictable if it gets out of hand, of course, but within the moment, Hezbollah and Israel, in the north of Israel, the south of Lebanon, seem to be honoring the rules of engagement and not escalating, but simply showing the other side that they're there, and so shelling and shooting back and forth every day, leaving the border areas depopulated in the meantime. In terms of the Houthis in Yemen, they've raised the stakes a great deal by attacking international shipping, and then Iran attacking US bases in Syria and Iraq also is raising the temperature, but it all seems to be within acceptable limits without it going all out war. These things are unpredictable. Somebody could make a mistake and it could get out of hand, and we could have a regional conflagration. At the moment, it's something completely unrelated, which is Baluchistan independence in Iran and Pakistan. Baluchistan is in both countries, and the Iranians and the Pakistanis are now firing into each other's countries and threatening war with each other. Where a few weeks ago they were on very good terms. Anything can happen now, and I would say that the great power in the United States is not managing this very well.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
You go ahead.
No, I think that last point's important because not just from the standpoint of the war, but just even politics in the United States. You keep thinking, what the hell's Biden doing? He's destroying his election chances, which aren't great to begin with. The whole world is condemned, not the whole world, but most of the world is condemning this. Is there do you see anything larger here, the U.S. role in the region as well as anybody? And I can't quite figure out why, at this particular point, 2024, we're seeing this.
The U.S. has consistently supported Israel in anything it does, including things that the U.S. publicly says it disapproves. It still pays for it, still supplies the weapons. I think we have to look at American actions more than at American words.
Yeah. It just seems strange that they would go all in with all this condemnation. Things aren't going well. It's really destroying his re-election campaign, especially among people who voted for him 4 years ago. So it's just the whole thing is weird. Scott, you had.
What I was going to ask about what's going on in Israeli politics, and I know that we've had a right-wing shift the last few years, decades.
Netanyahu is prolonging the war because he knows when it's over, he's out of office and he's going to prison. He's been trying to rig the Supreme Court. He's been trying to change the laws to keep himself. He's a bit like Silvio Berlusconi was in Italy when he became prime minister in Italy in order to stay out of prison. He's prolonging this in order not to serve time. And he announced yesterday that he was going to keep this going for months and months. There are huge demands, not just from the peace group, because the peace group is isolated and irrelevant, but from the right wing who want to get rid of it because they think he blew it on October the 7th. He ignored all the signs. And then his war, while being very destructive, is not being very successful. Hamas is still there, it's still fighting, and people are dying for nothing. He's very unpopular, even on the right. But while the war is going on, they feel, at least his cabinet feels, they can't get rid of him because the government will fall apart. It'd be very hard for anybody now to put together a coherent cabinet.
Excuse me, we were talking about Assange a minute ago. I'm going to go back to the idea of journalists and reporters, because the coverage coming out of the West, I would assume, based on what I've seen from UK papers, it's similar to the US and Canada, has been pretty one-sided, right? Essentially, in many ways, just carrying IDF propaganda. During the International Court of Justice hearings in the US, they didn't show the South Africa and Ireland arguing against Israel, but then they showed pretty much all of the Israeli response to it. One would expect stuff from the US media, but is the kind of level of the way they've accepted and swallowed propaganda a bit surprising? And is there some way around this? I know one thing
Well,
that's
it depends on which media outlet you're referring to.
well, I'm talking about like in the US.
The US, I'm not in the US, so I can't.
Yeah.
But I listen to the BBC daily,
Yeah.
and their reporting has been excellent. It's been
It has
fair.
been?
It hasn't
Okay.
been pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli. It's been very fair.
Okay.
Correspondents like Jeremy Bowen, Paul Adams, Lise Doucette, who've been covering it as they would any war in the world, not taking sides. And they've been first rate. El País in Madrid, which has an English edition online, which is worth reading because it's the perfect antidote to the New York Times, which is, New York Times way to the right of the Israeli daily Haaretz, which has had some good coverage, unlike its American equivalent. So it's not that the whole Western world has been swallowing the Israeli line. The Irish press, the Irish Times have been very good as well. But the US usually falls into line with Israeli policies and excuses them. I know my own experiences at ABC, trying to get pieces on the air that showed Israel, what Israel was actually doing, the harm it was causing people, particularly in South Lebanon, where I was covering. Those pieces often didn't get on the air because they didn't tell the story that they wanted told, even though they were true and everybody knew they were true. But that didn't matter.
Is in European discourse, are they also throwing out these kind of allegations of anti-Semitism to people they don't agree with? Are you seeing that as well?
Oh, sure. So that's happening. That's happening in Britain and France, particularly. Yeah. And it can be very. I think it's wrong. I think that you can be very pro-Semitic, philo-Semitic, but not approve of what Israel is doing to the people in Gaza. It's irrelevant. Let's just say that this wasn't the Jewish state doing this. Let's say it was the Turks doing it. We would have no problem saying the Turks had killed 25,000 people in the last 2 months, and the US is supplying them, and we would say there's something wrong about that. And nobody would then come and say, you're just anti-Turkish. Because I wouldn't be just anti-Turkish. I'm anti-mass murder. And the people who have spoken, there are anti-Semites. We all know that, and that's a huge problem. But most of the people who are objecting to annihilation of Gazans and West Bankers are not doing it because they don't like Jews. It's because they don't like murder. They don't like ethnic cleansing. They don't want to see these people suffer. And it has nothing to do with religion or one's racial views. Those things are completely irrelevant. You just take the actions and judge them on their own merit, whoever does them.
Do you sense there'll be any kind of increased support from other Arab states? I know many of them have signed on to the South African allegations in terms of like actually reaching out and helping Palestinians, not so much. Do you think there's kind of
the Arab states have been wholly supine throughout this. They've made rhetorical gesture, but that's to humor their own populations who feel very strongly in favor of the Palestinians. So they make statements to appease popular opinion, but not that they have to worry too much about popular opinion because none of them are elected. But if you compare this to the October War of 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched the war to get back the territories that Israel had occupied in 1967, the Arab oil states had an embargo. They announced a total oil embargo on the United States and the countries that were helping Israel. And that had an impact. Okay, but I don't see Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Kuwait getting together for an oil embargo now for the people in Gaza. The people in Gaza aren't getting help from anyone. They're just being ignored. The Egyptians aren't saying anything, they're not doing anything. The Saudis, the Kuwaitis, the Emiratis are not doing anything. So I don't think the Palestinians are naive enough to look to the Arab states for any kind of meaningful help.
Did you, Scott?
Yeah, it almost seems like they're using this as an opportunity to target Iran. There's been this, conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia, some of the oil states. And it seems, if anything, they're seizing on this, hoping that this moment will lead to some weakening of Iran through weakening Hezbollah or Syria or whatever.
That may well be the case, but remember, Iran and Saudi finally established diplomatic relations through Chinese mediation, and things were improving on that front. I think the Saudis still would like to have that better relationship with Iran so that they won't have to continue their stupid war in Yemen, for example.
Yeah.
Right.
Saudi, in terms of Hezbollah, Saudi doesn't care about that.
The European Parliament this week announced that called for a ceasefire, voted the support a ceasefire. But then in the US, just in the Senate in the last day or two, they tried to pass some resolution or pass a law to say that the US couldn't sell weapons it had to enforce its law that couldn't sell weapons that were committing human rights violations. And only like 11 senators voted for it, either on the left progressive side with Rand Paul, who's like a right-wing libertarian. And I'm curious about this because I believe that the Macron has also called for a ceasefire a while back. And so I'm curious if you see this if there's this split going on between with the Europeans and the US. The US is definitely like a right-wing country with a right-wing political system. But like, how do you see what the European, more and more Europeans sort of nation states calling for a ceasefire? How is that going to have any effect?
First of all, the only person who can call for a ceasefire is Netanyahu himself.
Yeah.
And he has to be forced to by the only country that gives him the wherewithal to continue the killing, which is the United States. And unfortunately, I'm a little bit surprised that even 11 senators voted to restrict arms sales to Israel. It's probably very brave of them. Some of them may lose their seats as a result. That the United States is going to go on supporting it, and it doesn't matter what the Europeans say. It's irrelevant. Some Europeans, like the British, are 100% behind the United States and Israel in this. They have no criticisms whatsoever. France is sitting on the fence. Italy has got a right-wing government. Hungary has a very right-wing government. They have no problem with killing Arabs. So I wouldn't put much hope in Europe.
And I guess that when you think about that, you wonder how this thing is going to play out, how it's going to end. Who has vowed to just continue pretty much for as doing whatever he wants to do as long as he wants to do it. You don't have this great outside support. You don't have support from the Arab states. How do you break this? Other than this, like this, in the U.S., there's fairly significant pressure on Biden, more so than I've seen in a long time. The other day, with regard to the Houthis, somebody asked him, are the strikes working? And he said, no. Are you going to stop? No. So they're essentially doubling down on a lot of stuff that's really not, setting aside from the horrible atrocities and war crimes, it's not working either. I'm asking you to be a seer in a way, but like, where does this go? I'm just worried and curious that there's no really decent outcome at this point.
You're in the States, I'm not.
Yeah.
You're in a better position to observe that. I can only see it from afar.
Yeah.
I have a better idea. I just spent a few months in Beirut. I have a better idea what's going on in the Middle East or here in Europe. But I think if people organize the United States in a meaningful way with an anti-war movement, that might move enough legislators to call for a change because they'd be afraid of losing their seats. But I don't see anyone galvanizing the public in that way.
I think Biden's willing to go down and lose over Gaza. That's what he's showing us this far. So it's just
maybe his calculation is that if he crosses Netanyahu, that he'll definitely lose.
Could be, yeah. I don't know. It's an ugly situation, and then with Trump lurking, it makes it even more complex and kind of scary.
I don't think Trump would have done anything different from what Biden is doing.
No, probably not. The rhetoric clearly is different. Although he wanted Netanyahu impeached, so Trump did.
No, he's a fickle ally. He once said he loved WikiLeaks, and then he prosecuted it.
Yeah. WikiLeaks is actually, I think, has some popularity on the right in the United States, I guess because of the Russia thing and stuff like that. I don't really know, but it's odd. Last thing in the Middle East, and we'll talk a little bit about your book. You mentioned you just been in Lebanon, which is interesting. Lebanon has had a lot of stuff going on for a few years now. The banking system's collapsed. What did you see there? What's the situation there? Because we don't really talk about it very much.
It's on its knees. The people cannot get their money out of the banks. The politicians have stolen all the money. It's broke. But many Lebanese have families outside who send in dollars. The dollar's worth a lot now because the local currency has collapsed. Many have started new businesses in import substitution because the country has no foreign reserves to buy things just like laundry detergent, simple things, building materials. So they're now making it themselves, which is not a bad thing. So a lot of new businesses have started up. Many young people have gone to the Gulf to work there and send money back. So it is still going, but there's a lot of tension because of what's happening in Gaza, that things could go wrong between Hezbollah and Israel, and that we might see a repetition of the 2006 Israeli invasion when Israel bombed all over Lebanon, took out every power plant, every bridge, hospitals, schools. I mean, really devastated the country. And it still hasn't recovered from that. And if they have to go through it again, people will be having nervous breakdowns. It'll just be too much.
Yeah.
And so everyone's hoping to avoid that. And I think that's one of the factors that Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, has to take into consideration, because a lot of those people who suffer are his fellow Shia, take into consideration before he ratchets it up too much in support of Hamas, which is not his. Hamas is really technically not his problem.
Yeah, Scott.
Yeah, I was going to segue to some
Yeah,
questions about your book. Your most recent book is Soldiers Don't Go Mad, a story of brotherhood, poetry, and mental illness during the First World War, which is, talks a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder or shell shock. And so maybe it's about within the British military. And maybe we could start off with just a question about like, how was PTSD or shell shock viewed by the British High Command during World War One?
Shell shock, as it was called at that time, became such a widespread phenomenon that they couldn't ignore it. They lost 100,000 men to shell shock, so they had to. It's like having a physical wound. You had to heal it before you could send them back into battle, and they desperately needed men at the front. So they opened hospitals all over Britain just to treat these people. They also sent psychiatrists to France and Belgium to try and treat them at the front lines quickly, to get, again, not because they're worried about their health, but because they needed them to fight. And the programs that they set up were done in spite of the belief that some commanders had from an older generation, that the men were just malingering and they were faking it in order to avoid battle, which would have been a perfectly rational thing to do. But anyway, in 90% of the cases, that was not happening. These people were really traumatized. They had symptoms that were uncontrollable: paralysis, mutism, going deaf, nightmares that kept them awake all night, shaking, terrible trembling. They couldn't control these symptoms, and the doctors had to get to the root of them and deal with the trauma that they had suffered in the front lines before they could get rid of the symptoms and then enable them to go back to fight.
As I was reading through it, I think about that scene from the movie Patton, which is actually based on a true story, where Patton is in the hospital and there's the young soldier who's been affected by shell shock, and Patton slaps him and calls him a coward. And I'm wondering, how was within the British military, was there a view that that the faking it, or that these men were just like cowards trying to get out of it, and how much of that was like a popular sort of thought?
It's that story about Patton, which did happen, is very interesting, because when I was researching the book, I read a lot about it. That soldier, whose name I now can't remember, was shell shocked, and he wasn't a coward. He was telling the doctors he wanted to go back to his unit, and because of the symptoms, they wouldn't let him. But Patton didn't know that. One of the reasons it was so awful what he did was because the man himself was not faking it. He was actually wanted to go back. He wanted to get cured to go back. And in the British Army in World War I, because it was a relatively new phenomenon, it was the first industrial war. People had nervous breakdowns in war, but not in these numbers. They were at the front in underground, days and nights of heavy artillery bombardment, poison gas, flamethrowers, mines in the forward areas that they had to go into no man's land. And they faced every kind of horror and also aerial bombardment, completely new in warfare. I mean, and then seeing their best friends or their own brothers cut down in front of them, or themselves being blown into the air and buried. Many of the shell shock patients were actually dug out from under hundreds of feet of mud because they'd been blown into the air and buried alive. And they'd been through hell. And so there were large numbers of these people that had to be dealt with. And many of the high command did think that even those were faking, but most came around to the view that in fact this was a real problem, and they needed good psychiatrists. Remember, psychiatry was a new science at the time. They needed good psychiatrists to deal with it. And some of the psychiatrists were useless and some were excellent.
And you wrote about the Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, among others, poets, and you had this significant, right at the end of the war, people were writing novels, quite on the Western Front, poets. How was that received? Because it's probably different. I don't know if there had been a kind of that kind of public outpouring of kind of grief and anger at the end of a war like that. People like Owen, Sassoon, was that like accepted, and were they immediately well regarded?
They were very well regarded as poets, yes. In terms of their politics, Sassoon became a socialist at the end of the war and ran for parliament very briefly, didn't then abandon politics entirely. Sassoon's psychiatrist, William Hulse Rivers, also became a socialist and ran for parliament on a peace ticket, but he died before he was elected. The books that were written, like Parade's End by Ford Madox Ford, one of the great war novels, and All Quiet on the Western Front, were pacifist novels. And that war was so horrible and was fought for no discernible reason, no advantage to any of those countries except some imperial conquests, that everyone turns back on war. And the peace agreement was so bad that the Second World War was inevitable. And many of those people didn't want to fight the Second World War because they didn't believe in the First World War. So when you had some monster like Hitler coming along, a lot of people were already so anti-war that they didn't even want to fight him. The effects of that war were long-reaching. We're still living with some. Middle East, we're still living with the consequences of that war. All the borders that were drawn as a result of the peace settlements in 1919 are untenable, and that's why we still have these problems today in the Middle East.
Yeah, I do U.S. history. Even at the end of World War I in the U.S., there was this real revulsion against the war, and people like Owen and Sassoon, surprised me. I saw Americans referring to that, clearly a widespread influence. Scott, do you have any?
I had one more question about the book. Was there any poem like that stood out to you?
Strange Meeting, Owen's poem, where he goes to hell and meets the man that he killed the day before, and they lie together in hell. I haven't memorized it, but whenever I read it, I'm almost in tears. Soon called that poem Owen's Passport to Immortality. Remember, Owen died shortly after he wrote that poem. He was killed 4 days before the war ended.
Yeah. Going forward, are you gonna be going back to the Middle East? Do you have another book you're working on?
Right now, I'm just about to go to India for the Jaipur Literary Festival, and then I'll travel around India for a month. And then, not sure, I don't know what I'm going to do.
Yeah. There's always a steak and scotch in Houston.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Thank you, Charlie, for coming on the Green and Red podcast. We had some trouble, but we finally got it together. So we really do appreciate it. And hopefully we'll have you on again, and hopefully there'll be better times for Assange and for everyone else. This is Green and Red podcast. Thank you all for listening and watching, and we'll be back soon. That was Charles Glass, a known journalist, author, who's really done a lot of great work in the Middle East over the years, and who has recently been visiting Julian Assange and writing about that. This is the kind of stuff you get on Green and Red podcast.
And if you like what you heard today and you want to check out more, definitely follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. And if you're listening to us on any of the audio platforms, please give us a rate and review. It helps us with the algorithms. And then also, if you want to support the Green and Red podcast, please check us out at patreon.com/greenredpodcast, or go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit that support button. And then also, we have gotten in a number of new pieces of swag, which are hats that if you're watching this on video, you can see Bob wearing. But if you want a Green and Red podcast hat, please email us at greenredpodcast@gmail.com or message us through any of the social media channels in which I just named. And for $25, which will include shipping, we will get you a green and red hat. And they're pretty awesome. Look at them. It's a trucker hat. We're like that. That's how we roll. And for everybody else, go out and make trouble, misbehave, and we'll talk to you again real soon.